So I would now like to welcome today's speaker. So we have with us here today, Kelly Ross. And Kelly has been working in the jewelry industry for 25 years. In 1999, he opened an online jewelry store and he's trained as a gemologist and a rough diamonds grader. During this time, he was a police officer in the RCMP and SME on the criminal use of diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals. He holds a master's degree through which he researched the criminal use of diamonds, gems, and precious metals by drug trafficking organizations. And he's now an independent consultant and provides services to Jewelers Vigilance Canada and other international organizations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Kelly here. So you're good to start sharing your screen.
Yeah. Hi. How are you doing, Amy?
Looks good.
Yep. Okay. Okay, so thanks so much, Amy, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak to you, the group here about changes really in how police are addressing jewelry crime. As you mentioned, I've been with policing for a long time. I started in 1989, just outside Edmonton, and I left policing over just 10 years ago now. It's hard to believe, actually. But after that, I've still been involved in it and in a consulting way, training police, doing investigations as a civilian. And it's remarkable how it's evolved in that time. And yet to this day, there's tremendous gaps in how police approach jewelry crimes versus the technology that's available, the expertise that's out there, and the likely ability to solve significantly more crime than they currently do if they actually leverage those things. And so that's what I want to talk to everyone about today, is about that, how things have evolved. Go over a couple of cases to talk about how using gemologists, using people that are trained in diamond-specific expertise has been leveraged to solve crime. Some very serious organized criminals have been put behind bars because of the assistance of the industry and that expertise. And then we'll look later at, towards the end, some of the current projects that are ongoing and sort of the next level things that can be done. So I'll just move the slide deck slide by slide at the end, or maybe I'll just actually pop it into the actual screen here. It'll scroll better that way. So if we look at the history here, we see that go back maybe to when I was starting policing, it was not a very open kind of organization, the RCMP, nor were the municipal polices at that time. And rarely, going back to the 80s and the 90s, did police go out of the agency to get expertise or get assistance with anything. It was very rare. The ideology was that they could do it themselves, and there was lots of thoughts about confidentiality and whether or not information that was passed on to people outside of the organizations could be held in confidence, or whether that could sour a potential investigation. And then as time went on, police started to realize that especially in taking these investigations to court, not just jewelry or diamond-specific investigations to court, but lots of different investigations to court, they realized that there was other evidence that could have been collected and presented, but they weren't doing that. And so they started doing things like consultations, looking at the public as clients versus just a statistic, getting civilians as steering committee members, so that it really started to expose what the public was thinking and how to bring the public closer. And they started on this, and they embarked on what was called intelligence-led policing at that time. And that was basically let the information do the work. In its infancy, it wasn't very strong. It's significantly more robust now, intelligence-led policing, and almost every serious investigation, major crime investigation, has an analyst attached to it. Going forward, the last decade, definitely seeing where science enters the courtroom almost in every sophisticated case, not only for people's crime, but property crimes, proceeds of crimes, money laundering cases. Science is almost always there. And what police started to find in the early part of that decade was that you could have that experiential knowledge. You could have that 30-year police officer that has been dealing with drug dealers through the vast majority of the career, and they could use them as an expert witness. But in the absence of the science behind it, it was just experiential opinion. And having both the experiential knowledge and science, or some sort of research that went with it, collectively became a much stronger case in court. And so this is where police started to realize that they have knowledge gaps. And in this last decade, experts have been sought out more and more for various types of police investigations. And in this particular case, what we're talking about is diamonds, gemstones, precious metals kind of cases. All right. So if we look at some of the partnerships that we see today, this is fairly recently, even the Financial Action Task Force, and if you're not familiar with the FATF, they're the global body that creates policy that is related to money laundering, which is cascades down to each country's Department of Finance and the government, which then turns into legislation. And in Canada, that would be our proceeds of crime money laundering legislation. And so the FATF provides that. And interesting enough, the FATF basically relies on civilians to provide that information, which in essence then is creating policy and legislation that drives police action and authorities. The UN ODC, United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, same thing, very much reliant on civilians in their policy generation as well. The World Customs Organization has gone to that as well. It's really common. And so you see the UN ODC partnering with public, World Customs Organization, even the Canadian Police Knowledge Network based out of Eastern Canada. Vast majority of the courses that are part of the police learning network are civilian generated. So how does this then relate to jewelry crimes? We have to start talking, we have to understand then what it is around the jewelry crimes that makes them so important today, not only by value, but as it impacts our society. And so if we just look at jewelry crime types and related crimes as it relates to costs, let's examine that. And some of the ones that we've listed here, this is just a handful of them, everything from smuggling. And again, what we're talking about is jewelry related smuggling. So it could be rough diamonds, cut and polished diamonds, gemstones, gold, the unrefined gold, any of the things that fall within that spectrum. But easily, there's several cases that you can easily find that are easily $1 million or more. They're often publicized, but there's very little data around that. Money laundering in Canada as it relates to this, there's very little data known around this. Drug trafficking as it relates to criminal use of these products. It's relatively unknown what the dollar values might be around that. And then lastly, human trafficking, largely unknown too. And why this is really important is because if we look at the last three, we see things like counterfeit, residential theft, robbery, break and enter, fraud. We can actually attribute dollar values to them because those are specific to those commodities. right? Somebody stole $250,000 worth of jewelry from a jewelry store, or they stole $100,000 or $50,000 from somebody's personal collection in their house in a residential break and enter, so on and so forth. There's actually dollar values to them. But what police know and have the disconnect on is around things like smuggling, money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, because every one of those has a jewelry connection to it, but it's a subsidiary of the actual event. Drug trafficking, and we'll look at that in a moment, is hugely into diamonds, gemstones, and precious metals. It's a massive part of organized criminal drug trafficking in today's world, not only in Canada, but in the United States, most of the developed countries around the world. But when those type of organizations are taken down, we look at them, or police historically have looked at them against the value of the drugs, or how much drugs they've taken off the street, not in terms of the jewelry assets that, or the gems or gold assets that have flown through. Same with human trafficking. Money laundering is more commonly uses these products. However, where the gap is with policing is being able to draw the nexus between the actual use of these products and the funds generated as proceeds of crime. And if you can't make that connection, if you can't say funds generated over here were used to buy these things over here, and you can't connect those together, then you're not able to attribute those assets to the money laundering part of it. And there's some great research done on that back in the late 90s by Stephen Schneider out of St. Mary's University on the East Coast. So these were some of the gaps exist, but if we look though at some of these common ones, like drug trafficking I mentioned, what we do know is that criminals use these products as part of the organization, as a function of their status symbols that these things can impart, so things like Rolex watches, heavy chains, whatnot, as a storage of wealth, as an alternate currency. And the number one reason they use these things for within their organization is a function of profit. Theft, robbery, break and enter, and fraud. This is remarkable because this is at the commercial level. So things like robberies of jewelry stores and break and enters of commercial facility, maybe a rooftop entry, stealing diamonds, those kinds of things. Easily 50 million lost out of the Canadian industry alone. And the real big one is residential theft. So break and enters into a house where criminals steal jewelry from the house. Almost everybody that has jewelry stores it in the master bedroom, and the criminals know that. They go into the master bedroom, they steal a pillowcase, throw the jewelry in, and they're out the door. And as they're leaving, they're stealing anything else that's not bolted down that is of value, things like cash or electronics, so on and so forth. They're in and out in a couple of minutes. But that's to the tune of about 125 million across Canada. And all that product gets moved back into the legitimate market. And so there's this historical movement of product through and around the jewelry industry, but it starts with the legitimate jewelry cycle. And if we go back in time, we can look just like at diamond production alone. We can go back to the early 1900s when there was producing about 10 million carats of diamonds per year, to the apex of diamond production in around 2005 at 170 million carats per year. It's been decreasing since then. I think the average is around 110 or 115 million carats nowadays or so. And but overall, we've got billions and billions of carats of diamonds that have been produced in the last hundreds of years, which is absolutely remarkable because the vast majority of those people that purchased or acquired those diamonds are gone. The diamonds remain. And of course, this is diamonds coming out of the ground, not necessarily the ones that are cut and polished and used in jewelry, but as it relates to the ones that do find their way into jewelry, they just get passed on as heirlooms. They get sold back to a legitimate market, and therein lies the jewelry cycle. All those things keep going around, unless they get thrown over the edge of a boat, like you see in the movie Titanic. It's at the bottom of the sea. It's no longer going to be in the jewelry cycle anymore. But the vast majority of product continues to roll around in that jewelry cycle. And what's interesting about that is what happens as it relates to criminals. So you have criminals that intercept these products within the legitimate market. So they will steal from wholesaler suppliers, steal from jewelry stores, they'll steal from people themselves, residential break-in enters, as I was mentioning, and they move these products then back to the legitimate market through places like jewelry stores and pawn shop auctions. These are really common. One of the most common ways, though, in today's world is moving these products through a drug dealer or a fence. And there's there's a number of studies that were done in the last 2 decades on how this phenomenon of stealing jewelry and other products that once would have been sold to a fence, somebody that deals in buys and sells stolen property, has now moved into singularly selling these or trading these products to drug dealers, where the drug dealer has, in essence, become the fence. And what we realize from this, some of the studies have shown that as much as 30% of the people that do these types of thefts, break and enters, only dispose of their jewelry through trading for drugs. That's a remarkably high number of people simply moving jewelry over to the over to threat actors like drug dealers for drugs, because what that means then is the drug dealers have regularly have a large cache of jewelry on hand as part of their organized enterprise. And there's excellent justification for that, because in other research done, we find that the drug dealers are basically marking up their wares, amphetamines, their cocaine, their heroin, their marijuana, for various street level purchases. And so by virtue of that, they're already profiting on that markup, yet they're taking in the jewelry at a fraction of its actual true value against that. And then they have to sell it back to the legitimate market to actually become profitable in the end. So it's a two-step process for the drug dealers. They take the jewelry, diamonds, or gold in trade from the people that have done the theft, and then they have to move it back to the legitimate market through pawn shops, suppliers, wholesalers, back into the jewelry stores themselves. And by virtue of doing this, they've not only laundered it, but they've made excessive profits on this. And if you go back to what I was talking about, what that acronym, why criminals use these things, status, wealth, ultimate currency, and profit. Profit is the key driver of this, and that's why they've moved into this new way of doing business. And so if we look at that and we actually juxtapose it against the numerical values, we start thinking about, well, we've got 124 million in residential break-in enters, 50 million or so, just an annualized basis as it relates to break-in enters, robberies, those kind of things against actual jewelry stores or people within the industry. It's a massive amount of money that is exiting the industry, but then also re-entering in this jewelry cycle. Remarkable. If you look at the component parts, they're treated in different ways. Gold, melted, recycled. Diamonds, not so much. They can just be reinserted into other jewelry. Often they're sent out of country. They might be repolished, recut. If they've got laser etchings, most of them do nowadays, but often they're just mounted in particular jewelry that hides the girdle on the stone. Looking at the global market flow for precious metals, we can see that recycling of gold is a huge part of that annual process. And this is quite a busy schematic that's taken from the World Gold Council, but basically the gold's produced over here, and then it enters the market over here, fabrication, wholesalers, retailers, consumers. The interesting part is these parts here, because this is where those parts over here is where the actual gold starts to move back to legitimate market. We see scrap over here, and then it pulls back. The scrap goes back over into the front end of the smelting and refining section for the schematic, and which in turn brings the gold back into legitimate market. That's just a more explicit example of the jewelry cycle as it pertains specifically to gold. Interesting, 26% of the annual supply is recycled. That's around the gold. We're talking about, what does it say here? For 10-year average over 2012 to 2021, about 1.2 tons. That's a lot of gold. I haven't done the math on the value of that, but that's a lot of recycled gold. And vast majority of it, or a large part of it, I'm going to say vast majority, a large part of it's going to be illicit. And so this is really quite remarkable. So this is where the expertise becomes tremendously valuable. We looked at the types of crimes of the jewelry cycle. We see that criminals steal these products, re-enter them back into the legitimate market. By virtue of the fact that you can melt gold, it's hard to really pin the tail on the donkey or repatriate those products back to legitimate owners. Diamonds, if they have serial numbers, you might be able to find the owner, that kind of thing. They're really hard, and where thefts of cars result in about a 60% return rate, theft of jewelry results in about a 5% return rate. It's not very common that a jewelry is stolen or these products are stolen, that they're going to get returned to a legitimate owner. But that's based on the current process employed by police. If they employed techniques or expertise that the jewelry industry or gemologists or diamond experts could offer, that could change things dramatically. And if we look at these different types of crimes here, we have smuggling, again, money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, theft, robbery, counterfeit, the same ones we looked at before. You could see that there's various linkages police want to make in order to come up with the elements of the offense. Smuggling, for instance, you want to be able to show that the commodity is of foreign origin or not Canadian, right? And then you can establish value for duty, things like that. Country of origin, if you can establish that, that becomes super valuable. Things like understanding metal and purity, the markings on that can help with that as well. With money laundering, there's so many things related to that. The key for police is timelines, determining foreign origin, value exceptions, so where things are misvalued as it relates to trade-based money laundering, and then ownership as well. Jewelry industry expertise or diamond jewelry, gemological expertise can help with country of origin, when these things were produced, when they're acquired, used for what purpose. Expertise of the industry could tell you, that these particular types of jewelry are used for this, that, or they're not stored in the manner that they should be, consistent with pearls, for instance, or whatever. 24-karat gold would be stored these kind of things. Some of it's opinion evidence, but it's knowledge that the industry and experts have, how these products would be used, disposed of, and things like evidence on the actual pieces themselves, trackable observations such like serial numbers and things like that on watches or gemstones that could lead them back to legitimate owners or where they might have originally come from, foreign ownership. So these are some of the things that become tremendously important, but currently really aren't pursued unless it's the most serious of cases, and then they start to look for the expertise. However, there is expertise all over the place. There's within the jewelry industry, jewelers, we know there's thousands of jewelers across Canada, and there's all kinds of gemologists, and there's diamond experts, and people at various levels and with various expertise as it relates to precious metals and diamonds that could be tremendously valuable to criminal prosecutions. And they're just not being leveraged at this time. Look at some cases and to get an idea of how simple or complex different um, um, applications of jewelry or gemological or diamond-specific expertise can be. And this is a great example. Residential break-in enters. This on the right-hand side is a snapshot of a article that was in the newspaper. And what we're talking about here is a vehicle stopped by the police, and in the vehicle, there were some people with some foreign credentials that seemed to be out of place, not necessarily tourists, and really didn't have a good story about why they were where they were. And when they were extracted from the vehicle for further investigation, a pile of jewelry was found, about $73,000 worth of jewelry. There was actually, I think it was more like just under 100,000 in the end. And what was done with this jewelry, it was analyzed by people that were experts in the industry. They looked for things, markings on the jewelry that police had no idea about. And what happened with this case, which is quite remarkable, was the officer, I spoke to this officer afterwards, and the officer involved was really, he was very passionate about seeing the jewelry getting returned to whoever it owned to, whoever owned it rather, than a lot of other officers that I've seen before, and kind of went to the end of the earth to find people that might be able to help, people that were really good at reading hallmarks, people that could search various databases and things like that that were outside the realm of the database the police would use, and ultimately found some really great information, and both on the jewelry, but markings, triangulating things like certain pins that were there, like 40-year company pins, and asking the question of the company, who's ever been around here for 40 years, things like that. I mean, it's kind of a simple work, and doing some people do some internet open source work, and ultimately we're able to find out who the owners of the jewelry were so they could return it to them. But that resulted in charges of possession of stolen property, break and enter, and the people that were in possession of the jewelry were actually deported. That in itself was a remarkable thing that happened. The best part about this was what the people who got the jewelry back said, and it was that the owners of the jewelry were very thankful for the efforts of the police and were grateful for the return of their property, because that's where these things become critical. It's not like a pair of pants or something that we have on a day-to-day basis. Jewelry pieces often have a very sentimental connection. If we go back to the jewelry cycle, I talked about all those pieces of jewelry, all those diamonds that came out of the ground for the last 100 years, but a lot of them are still in the same families that they were bought into. They've just been passed down because of that sentimental value to them. And same holds true here. And this detective work and using things that are on the jewelry was tremendously valuable to solving this crime. Another case, and this is a drug production case. And what you have here is criminals that are accepting jewelry in exchange for drugs, and they're exchanging it by the kilo. Then they would sell the stolen jewelry back to the market. That's how they would launder it. There was over $2 million worth of jewelry that was seized. That's a pile of jewelry. But looking at the bank accounts and understanding the money flows, you could tell that this was something that had been gone on for a long time. There's probably in excess of 5 or 6 million that had moved through the criminals' hands, pardon me, of jewelry in about 5 years. In this particular event, jewelry evaluation and tracking was employed, and markings on the jewelry was able to attribute jewelry to other people other than the criminals that were in possession of it. There was a diamond with a serial number on it that was able to be tracked. And ultimately, through going through all the jewelry, there was 11 separate criminal events that were able to be connected to this massive pile of jewelry, 2 million in jewelry that was there. And one of them was, in fact, a robbery as well. So 11 of them were residential or commercial break and enter events, and one was a robbery. So in essence, that was 12 new charges of possession of stolen property. And what was very interesting about this is when you look at the timestamp relative to when these different events happen. Here's for instance, the first event might have happened in 2007, the second one in 2008, then the third one in 2013, so on and so forth, so that they weren't just in one part of the entirety of the jewelry seized. They were slowly spaced out through them all, so much so that the court then considered the entirety of the $2 million worth of jewelry as stolen product or proceeds of crime because of all those 11 or 12 events that were able to be attributed to crimes that were a function of all that jewelry. Spectacular to seize and hold all that, because a lot of that jewelry could not be determined as to who actually owned it or where it came from. It was believed to have been stolen, and the courts believed that. So it was forfeited to the crown, which was fantastic. There's some interesting things. I got to participate in this one, and this was really interesting because lack of knowledge is often something that not only afflicts police, but it afflicts defense counsel. And in this case, defense counsel was trying to insinuate that a lot of the gold, that because there was melted gold as well, was a function of them buying filings from dentists. Dental filings were being collected and bought by the suspects in this manner. And they produced document in court showing that this different gold shops buy this stuff from dentists. But what they didn't realize was that there was a typo error on the documents that they brought to court, and it was supposed to say fillings, not filings. And suddenly that element in court, defense counsel that produced kind of fell apart. But and there was some humor around that, and all this to say that what you see on TV for court often is not the way it is. It's often a lot more civilized, and it's just a presentation of fact. And as it relates to, and this is important because as it relates to assistance to police, some people shy away from it because of the possibility that they might have to attend court later. And it's this is all just to say that it's not quite as bad as it might appear. One of the things that was so valuable to this was, again, all these items, these 12 cases that were solved, meant that jewelry got to be returned to the individuals, and that was tremendously valuable to them. There's some, if you want to call it, closure, and police need more of this, and so do the public. Again, we're talking about things that are heirlooms and are very, very important. As it relates to property, often there's no other property more valuable to people than things like jewelry. And so this was a real win for police and the Crown. Case number 3, this is a money laundering for a drug dealer person. And they laundered about $25 to $30 million of the drug dealer's money over about a 5 to 7 year period, almost exclusively through the diamond industry, but they operated also a jewelry store, and they bought gold off the street. And they made, with that gold, they melted it down and they made fake gold bars. And so they did all kinds of great stuff with it. And with the help of experts, were able to look at these products and see how they could be used as evidence in court. And so the gold bars, quite interestingly, were packaged and were brilliantly made. But if you put a 1 ounce, one of their 1 ounce or 10 ounce gold bars on a scale, it quickly showed you that it wasn't 10 ounces or it was a 1 ounce. It might only be like 22 grams or that kind of thing. It was way off. And so then you knew right away it wasn't genuine. Some of the assay results for gold resulted in excellent evidence against the suspects, because they said they only used gold up to 14 karat, and all that stuff that they melted was a function of that. Yet the assay results of the stuff that came back was often 21.3, almost 24. The diamonds, they had pre-certs on them. They weren't fully certified. And able to track them back to the EU, European Union, and based on the timelines, they could see that they were purchased within the time frame that the criminal was active in laundering proceeds of crime. And this becomes really critical because the items that police can seize are a function of that timeline, that they can prove that they were active in criminal activity. And so that timestamps on these diamonds were valuable for that. Some of the problems were using non-certified gemologists, and when turn around and actually use proper gemologists or people that knew what they were doing in the diamond world, then that turned the case around. Problems in translation. Some of the diamonds flowed through Antwerp, some of them flowed through Israel, some of them flowed through London and then into Hong Kong, and almost exclusively were believed to be finished diamonds. But then upon examination of some of the invoices by diamond experts, they were able to say, no, some of them were actually rough diamonds too, because the markings on their sawables versus, SI1s and VS quality stones. And then comparative analysis, getting the industry to be able to say, hey, the parcel of diamonds that you've seized from these people is amazing. And that was part of the case that was critical, was that the criminal was acquiring almost all D, internally flawless, half carat or better, often 1 carat stones for a getaway plan. And they had about over $2 million wholesale, less than wholesale, but 25% discount to wholesale, in high-end diamonds that were all in that D flawless categories. And the parcel was so amazing that people within the industry said that they had canvassed some of the largest dealers in all of North America, and they weren't able to replicate that parcel. And so that became excellent evidence unto itself. But again, that was the diamond industry. This was people within the industry that were providing that expertise. So why don't police do more of this? Why don't they develop their own expertise? There's just so many reasons that they don't. A lot of it is statistics. Going back to what I showed you about drug dealing stats or human trafficking stats, it's not there. You don't see the connection or the nexus to the jewelry. Budgets themselves, changing mandates that change with governments. Little knowledge of the value itself. In the absence of these cases that I've just shown you, if they're not familiar with the potential value of using industry experts for these types of investigations and what the fruits could be of doing so, they just don't do that, and they'll go for the low-hanging fruit instead. They'll just charge somebody for the drugs, and they'll hopefully get a forfeiture on the jewelry, but they're not going to look for charges that relates to possession of stolen property or that kind of thing as relates to the jewelry. There's lack of resources around this, and this is Canada's Board of Services Agency as well. interesting enough, this is really interesting. I see CBSA too, but it's not just CBSA, it's around the globe. I travel around the globe and I do courses on this kind of stuff, the law enforcement everywhere. And I bring with me a pack um, of rough fluorite, and they're octahedrons. They look just like rough diamonds. They just don't have trigons and things like that all over them, and they don't have any kind of external stepped appearance, but they look, for all intents and purposes, the same, and use it for the training purposes that I do. And I go through customs all the time, and I go through all the checkpoints all the time, and my bags are open all the time and exposed, and those things are sitting right there, and nobody ever questions around them. And it just makes me think that, boy, Kimberly process or not, these things, you can just take them with you, and the people like law enforcement or customs, whoever it might be, they even ask you about them, even when they're sitting beside gemological instruments and other things that look like you would want to ask about these things. But it's a lack of knowledge that's out there, and so it's not just it's all over. It's every element within this within crime as it relates to diamond, gemstones, and precious metals. Yeah, and there's things like attrition, retirement, so you get people that do have some expertise and they move on. And promotional structure won't keep people within that expertise, they'll move them off to someplace else. And so ultimately it becomes really too difficult to retain and maintain this type of expertise. What about a future state? And this is one of the things that I like to advocate. And it has to do with jewelers, gemologists, experts in their field as it relates to diamonds or precious metals or gemstones. And there's an amazing opportunity for jewelers and gemologists. What police do when they get a case and they take it to a jeweler, they just want a valuation on it because that's what they need to produce in court. There's an amazing opportunity because police don't know, but jewelers can ask or gemologists can ask a question. What's the case about? Get some details about it. And in essence, they can be looking for elements on that, the jewelry that could further the police investigation. Things like serial numbers, chipping on the diamonds. Might be indicia of them being pulled out of the clasps or the mounts by way of non-traditional tools, pliers, those kind of things. There's a whole host of information that can be gleaned off the jewelry that police aren't asking for, but just asking them if they want you to, just asking them if they would like you to report anything that might be suspicious or relative to evidence is going to get a yes from them for sure, because first of all, they didn't even know that that could be found. You just really have to tell the police that you're alive to the police practice and collection and handling of evidence, and that there might be things on there that could help them out, and they're going to ask you to go find it. Then it's just a function of, in essence, training the police. I'll tell you about a couple new projects that are on the go right now. I work with working with a professor at Edinburgh University, Dr. Maria McLennan, and she's a forensic jeweler over there. And we've been working on a project. When I was in policing, I was just before I retired, I was working on a drug residue research project with the RCP lab. And basically, as you know, diamonds have an affinity for holding oils and grease. And as a function of that, they hold everything else, any other residue around them, more than most products do. And so if they're handled in the same manner that drugs are, and they're weighed on the same scales that drugs are, then they're going to have a higher, likely have a higher drug residue content on them than average jewelry. And so we're looking at that to see if there is a correlation between that. If it's positive, that'll be a valuable piece, valuable tool for law enforcement. It's not something that will allow conviction, but it's things that'll help support warrants or proceeds of crime assertions made by the Crown. Pardon me. We're also creating a jewelry analysis course. So just like I was talking about a moment ago, things that you would ask police and the things you look for, it's really for jewelers and gemologists and people in the industry that want to do more as it relates to provide evidence for police or get into that world. And it covers things like chain of custody, what kind of evidence that could be extracted from jewelry, tracking, so on and so forth. And that should be piloted this year. We're just letting the ink dry on the T's and the I's right now. So other potential things, diamond fingerprinting, if you go back to what I was talking about smuggling, you're familiar with, I know you're all probably quite familiar with diamond fingerprinting and different techniques that could potentially do this. Some might be stronger than others, but the reality is if one were to be able to say that they could identify diamonds from one particular country, then any other diamonds that don't fall into that identification process would then be from out of country. And as it relates to the Customs Act, this is critical. That's proof of foreign origin of the Customs Act for forfeiture and all kinds of other things that could happen with that. So a country like Canada with a handful of diamond mines, that could be a really powerful tool. Gold impurities in unrefined gold, like borax minerals, those kind of things can be very telling in terms of their origins. Detrital material in the same token, detrital material analysis for alluvial gold smuggling, things like that can bring it back to the source. And residue analysis on diamonds, a little bit different than drugs that I was talking about, more as it relates to DNA to identify both suspects and or owners. Right? So somebody found in possession of jewelry and they can't explain how they have them. Doing a swab, a DNA swab, might in fact tell you actually who owns it. And these are things that aren't collectively or really pursued right now as techniques that could assist with law enforcement, but there's potential there. There's lots of hurdles. It's really on the police side, I think, in understanding and getting trust, confidence in industry, those kind of things. And I think in time that is starting to change. We're already seeing that start to happen. But there's also around expert witnesses too, and some people might not necessarily want to do that kind of stuff as well, being in court for police. And that takes me to the end of the presentation. And I'm sorry, I pretty much took us right to the top of the hour. I was hoping to back us up by about 5 minutes, so I really ran through that last slide pretty quick. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them or try to.
Thanks, Kelly. That was an awesome presentation. I think most of us on this call are geologists, and I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to get the diamonds out of the ground, but not necessarily what's happening with them afterwards. So that was definitely an interesting, different perspective than anything that I've kind of thought about before. I'm going to head off the question and answer period now. So let me I'll stop your screen sharing here. And then if anyone has a question, they can either just ask it directly or you can send it to me in the chat. I'm gonna get started because I have something to ask here. One thing, I think most of the participants are geologists here, and I'm just wondering if you have any kind of red flags that you would say for us that would be like key to notice, because we are kind of working on the way more upstream side of things, right? Like we're working at the mine site or kind of the rough diamond stage, and then that's as far as we kind of get. So do you have anything that might be useful that for us to kind of be thinking about?
Yeah, so at that stage, I think more about, I really start to think about the use of claims, the use of assaulting of samples and those kind of things as being something that would be worth watching for. We've had some history of that in Canada. Everybody remembers CKDM diamonds out of Saskatchewan, or the Cassavants that operated that near the Fort Elacorn project. I think that's operated by Rio now, Rio Tinto and Shore. I'm not sure, but what was interesting about that was the people involved had no experience, right? So those would be kind of red flags. They're into the claiming, staking claims in diamond industry, but with no background, no experience. And it's interesting because that kind of red flag doesn't just hold true on something like that. We see that all the way through, all the way up to, insurance fraud. On the other side, more at the jewelry side, where people would do an insurance fraud, operate a jewelry industry or a jewelry business for about 2 months, and then suddenly claim that they lost all their jewelry or they was broken into. But in the background, they had no, experience. They never in the industry before. So those are things that are red flags, for sure. I think regulatory rigors as well, depending on what jurisdiction. I mean, Canada's pretty good, but there's places overseas that might have less rigors than North America. And so wherever there's a exploitable loophole because lack of regulation, then that should be something to be wary of.
Awesome. Thanks. I have a question from Brooke in the chat right now. He's asking, do you know if criminals have tried to infiltrate Canadian mines and get illegal rough diamonds?
Yeah. So not in a large way. The way the organized criminals have tried to infiltrate Canadian mines is more on the drug side, right? Just to get people, be their suppliers, that kind of thing. Less so as it relates to acquiring diamonds. And having said that, there is very few cases of attempted or thefts from Canadian diamond miners, and very small thefts at that, 1 or 2 stone kind of thing, or lost shipments that couldn't be found, those kind of things. But very, very few and far between, and very little value.
Thanks. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to ask Kelly?
I have a question. So you touched briefly on the criminals trying to get off the diamond serial numbers in order to sell them and reset and repolish, recut the diamond. So what are different ways how those numbers can be sold off?
Taken off, yeah.
How deleted and how easy it is, and does the diamond need to be completely recut, or there are some easier ways to get rid of the number?
That's a great question, Maya. So years ago, if you remember the old polar bear diamond, that's been resurrected. It's back. But when they first started laser marking those stones, it was really big. You could actually see it with the naked eye, back then. You could see a little dark spot on it like that. And it was quite a marking. Today, the laser markings are significantly less invasive. And I know this for myself, I bought diamonds and tested. If I take some jeweler's rouge on a buffing wheel and with my Dremel, I can take that serial number off on today's diamonds. Not necessarily completely remove it, but you have to remember that the serial numbers now, even at 10 power, can be hard to spot. Binocular 10 power can be even hard to spot because some of them are so small and so faint. But that's when they're actually standing out. If you remove the surface features that they have, then in essence polish out the black etching that is the laser mark into it, then it becomes really, really hard to see. Now, I know this from personal experience. A jeweler actually told me that they polished the serial number off. I said, you can't polish the serial number off. And he said, I did. And so I got a cheap one from Stellar, and I did it. I did the exact same thing with a Dremel and a polishing wheel and some jeweler's rouge, and took it off. So it's actually super easy to do. But then the other side is, even at that, mounting diamonds in a bezel set or something that hides it as well as the other side, to selling it, so it can't be observed.
Mhm.
Oh, we have a question from Roy Bastu. He's asking, are you able to elaborate on how conflict diamonds might enter a legitimate diamond supply chain, or what are common places in the world where those rough diamonds might be washed?
Oh, yeah. So I went to Belgium once and I went into the diamond bourse and dropped my passport, got introduced to a guy to buy some diamonds. And I selected about 6 3-grainers or so, and it was around 5 or 6, I don't remember anymore. And when I asked him for the KP certificates and how he was going to get those ready for me, he said no. On all his small buyers like me, he doesn't provide any certificates. It's up to me to deal with that. But as you know, if you go to Belgium, you can't do that. They have to supply them. And he said that all the small buyers like me simply put them in their pocket and take them across the border. And so without KP certificates, then they're in essence exactly what we're talking about here. And I would then have to find a diamond cutter to cut them, to move them then into the legitimate market. The next step is pretty easy. Some cases that I dealt with would have diamonds smuggled into Canada and sports equipment, things like that. And they then would take them and smuggle them into the US, have them cut and polished there, and then sent back to Canada as cut and polished stones. And yeah, so it's fairly easy, can happen. And if we go back to what I was telling you about before, when I train, I train police officers from around the world, and I use these little cubes of fluorite that are basically just the same as 3 or 4 carat rough. I go through customs all the time and nobody asks a question. So when the person says, yeah, you could just go and drop them in your pocket, the guy at the bourse in Belgium, drop them in your pocket, take them across the border, or take them with you. You're not kidding. You could do that because most of the law enforcement, I don't think, would ever pick it up. I'm not saying do it. somebody will catch on, and then that's awful. Somebody be in a world of hurt after that. But that's the reality, and that goes back to what I'm talking about, is that there's just this lack of expertise in even just at the front lines, identifying where the criminal activity is.
Interesting. Marty, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Hi, Kelly. Yeah, thanks for that interesting presentation. I'm a diamond geologist with over 35 years in the industry, mainly corporate through exploration and evaluation and mining. Just to get back onto the rough diamond question. So the Kimberley process, is my understanding, accounts for about 99% of world production, and there's 54 participants from over about 81 countries. It's the tracking thing is the chain of custody is critical, and it goes from exploration through to mine production, from point of origin to sale. And that's the critical thing, is that the public should be, if they're moral about their diamond purchasing, should be asking for a document of chain of custody.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key aspect. Another aspect is I feel a little bit reluctant to say this, but I've worked at a site where rough diamonds were being absconded through a process recovery. And that's also very difficult to track, and that goes to point of origin. And to me, there's three key aspects to this. There's somebody on the ground. My gut feel is there's somebody involved in security, and my gut feel is that somebody's involved in IT as well.
Mm.
And how do you monitor or measure? How do you account for those aspects?
Yeah, there's some real complexities, and of course, it depends on the particular location, you know, the types of securities they have in place, how easy it would be to defeat either through human or electronic means. And yeah, you know, would love to have a sort of off the channel chat with you, Marty. You know, to explore this a little bit more, because there's so many nuances to it as well. You know, one of the things that is remarkable about this as well is a lot of sometimes there's a lot of loss built into the business model and the function of that. Purchases are done, street purchases are done in different locations in order to capture product that's in essence been lost from the mine through what you're talking about, that, you know, theft, incidental theft or organized theft. The reality is, though, what's being purchased back can't necessarily be attributed to that particular mine site. It could be coming from all different places across borders or whatnot, entered back into the legitimate, or what is considered then the legitimate stock or run of mine. You want to call it that. It's not exactly that anymore for the company. And that, in essence, in itself, is laundering and bringing it back. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of nuances to it, and each mine, each model is different. Yeah.
If I may, yeah, also say and throw it out to our technical experts there, in terms of rough diamonds, there's surface textures, there's internal structures, and there's mineral inclusions that can be identified. And that's can be an expensive and complicated process, but I'll throw that out to our illustrious community here.
Thanks, Marty. Yark is asking if you have any comments, Kelly, about crime related to artificial versus natural diamonds and trading in jewelry.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's super common now, especially in the the synthetic side. We're seeing having GIA marked stones and synthetic ones that are basically cut to the same proportions as a genuine one, with then the GIA serial number being impregnated onto the girdle of that stone to really make it look authentic, and then selling that. Everything from that all the way down to I've seen cubic zirconias cut into octahedral shapes with step patterns in them, and all really elaborate, and inserted into bags of rough as well. So from one end down to the other, and different mediums. I mean, we can even talk about we were talking about synthetic diamond, and I was talking about cubic zirconia on the other hand, and then of course we had the spada moissanite back in the late 90s too. Yeah, any kind of opportunity to substitute genuine for something else seems to be in the absence of the knowledge to tell the difference between the two, is an opportunity for criminal to commit a fraud.
And at what stage is that swapping happening? Like where are those artificial diamonds coming in? At what point?
All over. Yeah, originally the first ones they saw were really the Millet, the tiny ones, and in essence, they're so small that people weren't checking them. They weren't putting through testers and that kind of thing because it's very costly to be checking one or two pointers on your synthetic diamond tester. And but now it's moved into more sophisticated things like I was talking about, where a criminal will acquire a genuine stone, or not even get the genuine stone. They'll get a synthetic and make sure that the proportions meet very closely to what the genuine stone is, and then mark it accordingly with the fake or fraudulent trademark and serial number that matches the genuine one. Sell it with a fraudulent certificate.
No, that's great, Jarek. I just have a small story to tell. I did a presentation on a diamond in Prague a couple of years ago, and that was at the time the newspaper brought revealing news that all the diamonds in a collection of Natural History Museum in Prague were found to be faked. And it happened sometimes during the 90s. And it must be in quite an operation because in terms of shape and sort of commonly recognized features, it was pretty well done. So I'm assuming that those diamonds must spend time in a lab somewhere to create a fake one. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's interesting.
Sorry, Amy, I'll go ahead and then I'll ask question.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Follow up on those questions from Amy and from Jarek now and artificial diamonds. So you're probably anticipating, Kelly, and the police anticipating the huge flow of artificial diamonds now mixing up with natural diamonds. How are you preparing for that, and what what new crimes or just new features of the old crimes you will see because of that huge inflow of man-made diamonds?
Yeah, there's there's really so many ways you could use that. Like what's a 1 carat synthetic now sell for $200 US, 250 for something that might be FVS quality versus a genuine 1 carat at 7,000. So you can imagine the money laundering potential for that, right? In terms of trade-based money laundering, sending a parcel, 50 carats of synthetic, but labeling them as genuine and saying that they're worth this much, and somebody then has to pay you that much in return. So, it might only be worth, what, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, but instead it should be, $350,000. It's a tremendous difference in valuation, but that's where these things can be used. Trade-based money laundering for fraud themselves, but fraud would be the most common utilization for them. And again, it's because the lack of knowledge, and it really is up to the industry to have their ducks in the road to be able to test for these things and watch and expect that that's going to happen. It's no different than when moissanite came out, right? And the same things happened at that time. They were being used as for frauds, being put in place of a diamond, and of course the thermal detection abilities were not as refined back then, and the thermal testers back then were testing them, those moissanites, showing them, or making them out to be diamond. And so that was a really easy fraud to happen until they started looking at the optical properties of moissanite against diamond and so on and so forth. So yeah, it should be expected, and you know, you need to have the right proper tools and know what to look for and expect that, especially if you don't have a trusted supplier.
We have another question from Roy Basu, kind of along the same lines, but he says that he's seen synthetic rough in a parcel of rough diamonds, and what would be the incentive for doing that?
I guess it depends. Yeah, a couple different ways. Unless it was the whole parcel, I would say it's a fraud. If it was the whole parcel, it could be for money laundering purposes, the trade-based money laundering. But a single one within there is like salting a parcel, right? It'd be like having, you know, 1,000 Millet pieces of 2 pointers and adding 20 or 10% of them as synthetics into it. But nobody's going to check that entire parcel of 1,000 pieces. They're just going to make the assumption that they're all the same. For a larger one, that's interesting, because larger ones in a parcel, anything over 1/3 of a carat for sure, 1/4 carat's going to, you know, be put on an instrument to determine if it's genuine. But then again, if it's coming from a trusted source, until that source is no longer trusted, they might just enter them into inventory and not even know. But yeah, I would say be for fraud. It would be the reason.
Thanks. If no one else has any more formal questions, I'm going to stop the recording now. I think Marty's eager to get off of the formally recorded session, so maybe he can dive a little bit deeper. So I'm going to